Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
And special guest, Dr. Wade Mullen. Wade, welcome.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thanks, Clara. Good to be here with you.
Absolutely. So with us, we have Wade Mullen, Dr. Wade Mullen. He's a professor, a researcher, an advocate working to help those trapped in confusion and captivity that mark abusive situations. Wade is a fellow Pennsylvanian from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So we're not that far apart. We're about 2.5, 3 hours apart. So It's nice to have a fellow Pennsylvanian.
Yeah.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about your book, your upcoming book, Something's Not Right. We'll hold it up there for the viewers to see. Something's Not Right, Decoding the Hidden Tactics of Abuse and Freeing Yourself from Its Power. I got to say, Wade, excellent book. Excellent book.
Very good. Jimmy shared it with me, and it is truly excellent.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
It's good to hear.
Well, tell us a little bit about what led you into this, because you and I, this is the first time that you and I have actually spoken face to face, which is unusual because in the world of advocacy, it's a really small world. So we, and it's a tight knit community. So we, of course, know of each other and, interact. And I saw a lot of your research and was just really intrigued. Because what I like about what you do is your research, really talks about techniques that abusers use. And I really try to focus on techniques from a preventative perspective. So anyway, tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write this book.
Yeah, and I'll just say I really respect the work that both of you have been doing in the advocacy world on behalf of survivors. So it's an honor to finally meet you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So I was a pastor at a church outside of Philadelphia for about 8 years. And during the latter half of my time there, went through some really difficult experiences related to abuse and allegations of abuse. And I had attempted to advocate for those who had been traumatized and injured and harmed and were reaching out for help, and sadly discovered that there were others in leadership above me that wanted to shut those stories down. Yeah, it was a very difficult few years. And while I was going through that experience at the church, I was also trying to finish up a PhD program and had decided to focus my dissertation work on how evangelical organizations were using what are called impression management strategies in the wake of an image-threatening event. So something happens that threatens their reputation, threatens their image in the eyes of the people, in the eyes of the public, and then they get to work at using various tactics to try to defend themselves. And so I wanted to understand how that was happening, to what extent, if there were patterns that could be observed. And that research really opened my eyes. And I began to see that the same tactics that organizations that I was studying and researching, the same tactics they were using were the same tactics that I had observed in the abusers in my life, and realized, wow, there's a playbook, so to speak. There's a learned script that abusers and those who are enabling abusers are using in order to isolate people, in order to manage information, in order to escape responsibility and being held accountable for what they've done. And that work then just spun me out into the advocacy world, and I've been trying since to help people understand this is what to look for, and this is how you can combat these tactics if you do experience them.
I think that's probably why you took off so quickly on social media. Twitter seems to be your sweet spot, and I think just your ability to lay out step by step, this is what they're doing. Because one of the problems that I've always had with the research that I've read in trying to understand pedophile abusers is that you hear a lot about power and control and, manipulation and grooming and all that stuff. And in my mind, my brain was just screaming out, but that tells us nothing about what they're actually doing. And I think that's what sets you apart as, you lay out, step by step, and it's really methodical and it's meticulous what abusers are doing. And I think you do that in a brilliant way. And I'm excited that there's actually research that backs this, and that, you spent time doing your dissertation on that and you've experienced it. And I think it's interesting too, as a pastor myself, that there's this close parallel between what leaders are doing, intentional or not. And it almost seems like it has to be intentional, at least a big part of it. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But yeah, it's fascinating that there's such a close parallel between what church leaders are doing to cover up abuse and what the abusers themselves are doing. Do you think that it's intentional on the part of the church leaders?
Well, yeah, first I'll just echo what you've said, that I do think that the process is very similar that an abuser might go through in order to control a victim, and what let's say a team of leaders at the top of an organization might go through when they are approached by somebody with the story of that abuse. And so I say that tragically, then often the victim goes through a very similar process of being manipulated and deceived and controlled. There's research that's been done to try to understand whether or not people use impression management or these various tactics at a subconscious or semi-conscious, or are fully aware of what they're doing. And I think it's somewhere in between. What I've come to believe, at least this is what my current view is that there are individuals who intend to deceive. So they know what's true, but they don't want other people to discover that. And so they perhaps realize that if I just say this outright lie, let's say denying that something happened, this didn't happen, or that's categorically false, right? Mm-hmm. So they learn perhaps that that's effective. People perhaps, won't come back and challenge that. But let's say over time they realize that that's not effective, or in this scenario, a straight out denial is not going to work because the evidence is too clear. And so I have to acknowledge that something has happened. And so then that person might think to themselves, okay, since I have to acknowledge that something did happen, perhaps there's still a way for me to justify that or excuse that, or to somehow help people or get people to see that I'm not as bad as somebody else. And so I think over time that person learns a script. They learn what works and what doesn't work, and then they can adapt that script depending on the situation and depending on who they're speaking to. And I think over time, then that becomes increasingly embedded at a subconscious level. So it becomes second nature to that person, to the point where they really don't have to be as calculated as they once had to be. It just kind of rolls off the tongue.
I think that's spot on. I talk very often about the analogy between what abusers are doing and magicians, and this whole stage performance where you have the the part where you rehearse and you practice in front of the mirror, and then eventually in front of your friends. And, you get a small audience where if you mess up, it's not a big deal because they know that you're rehearsing. And so it's this meticulous planning and rehearsing and going over all the different scenarios. But then there's the stage performance. And by the time you go out and do the stage performance for the abuser, not only is it second nature, but it's almost boring because it's been so rehearsed. That's why abusers are so good at what they do. And I want you to talk about impression management, because when I read about impression management, for me, that was really helpful because I was like, now I have some way to label some of the things that I've been talking about. And impression management, when I read it, that was like this big awakening inside of me, just the way that you laid that out and described it. So talk about impression management. What is it?
It's simply managing the perceptions that other people are forming of you or an event or let's say a crime. And it can take various forms, but basically it's trying to get people to see only what you want them to see. And so if you imagine there's this landscape that you take somebody out to look at, and you only want them to see just a small portion of that landscape. And so perhaps you say, just look over there to your right. And the person attempts to kind of get a broader view of what they're looking at. And you say, no, just keep looking over to the right. So you're managing the impressions that person is forming of the landscape by controlling what they can see and what they can't see.
Well, you talked too about the curtain, when at a play or, something like that, where what goes on behind the stage is really equally as important as what goes on in front of the audience, but the audience doesn't see what's going on behind the curtain. Right. And I thought that was a really, really good way to describe that what happens on the other side of the curtain where the audience faces, that's what matters. And that's what you have the most control over. And I thought that was just a really good way to put it. Yeah,
there's this front stage and backstage version of the person or the people. And behind the curtain in the backstage, they can plan their performance. They can plan what they're going to present to the audience, and they know that the audience can't see what's happening behind the curtain. And so there's this split between the front stage and the backstage person, or the front stage version of the organization, and then what's happening behind the curtain. And so I think what's happening recently, for good, and it's good that it's happening, is more and more curtains are being pulled back, and then people are seeing, the audience is seeing, okay, what has been presented to us is not consistent with what's been actually happening behind the curtain.
Yeah, very good. I want to talk a little bit more about that, because I think what this book does, and I don't want to state your purpose for the book. I'll let you do that. But, it really gives people the tools to be able to start peeling back the curtain when a lot of people don't even know to look for a curtain. They don't even think in terms of that, because you hear things like, oh, well, he's such a good person, or look at all the good that he's done in his life. And it's like, we don't even think that there's a possibility that people are intentionally creating this very thick facade, where we're able to start peeling back the curtain piece by piece. So before we get into the why of the book, talk to us about the title of the book. Why the title, Something's Not Right?
I think that's often where a person might find themselves when they're in the middle of an abusive situation, is being able to recognize that things are not the way that they ought to be, that something isn't right. And perhaps they can't describe exactly what the problem is. They can't see what's lurking in the shadows because it just isn't clear yet. But they have this sense. Often it's a sense of fear, I think, that they are being used and abused, and they feel stuck and they feel confused. And so that's what's behind that title, is meeting people where they're at when they're at a point in their life where they're in a relationship or they're in an abusive situation, perhaps within an organization, and they just know that something's not right.
Well, that'll lead us to the why part of the book. What do you hope to accomplish with the book? What do you think when it lands in the hands of people? And I think this will land in the hands of a lot of people. What do you hope when they lay that book down, when they read the last words and they lay that book down, what do you hope is going to happen?
I hope they'll be affirmed, because so often you are in that place of just knowing that this isn't the way it's supposed to be, but you can't describe it. And because you can't describe it, you can't perhaps tell it to even yourself in a way that makes sense, or tell it to someone else or a professional. And so then you feel very alone. You feel very isolated. And then the abusers often make you out to doubt your own sense of what's true, and they gaslight you. And so I hope that it'll bring some affirmation so that people read it and say, no, I shouldn't have to live like this. There is, in fact, something really wrong with what I'm going through right now. And then I hope that they'll be able to have the language that they need to be able to describe what they're experiencing and what's happening to them. Because that's part of what I think renders us so powerless, is when we can't identify something, name it, and describe it. It's hard to have power over that.
Wade, I'll interject here that while reading through your book, I definitely received an affirmation that I was a victim of abuse in my marriage for years. It was not physical, but it was a very, very definite mental abuse. I went into counseling for 3+ solid years. And you're right. I couldn't put words to what I was feeling. I knew something was very, very wrong. I knew it for many, many years, but I couldn't find the words to put to what I was feeling, to what I was experiencing. Neither, unfortunately, could the counselor. And it wasn't until Jimmy's dad actually was arrested that in that moment, finding out what he had been doing and what was going on, that I finally realized how used I was. I was very much a victim of abuse, not in the same way as his physical, victims, but I definitely was. And I appreciate so much your book for, giving that affirmation, because you're so right. You feel powerless when you can't put a word, a name to what you're going through. It's an awful feeling, very helpless, very, very helpless. So I know that this book is going to help many, many people.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And
yes.
Well, I think too, Mom, as you were talking, I think about the song and the dance and just how rhythmic abusers are, because Wade, you talked about the second nature. All of this is second nature to them. They can dance circles around most everybody, no matter your level of education. And that's been one of the frustrations as an advocate that I've run into going into churches, is there's kind of this human mindset that because we think we're attentive, we actually are attentive, and we know what to look for. And so if somebody was manipulating me, I'd be the first to know about it, and I think abusers absolutely exploit that, because that's not reality. The reality is that abusers use really technical, sophisticated techniques and methods for getting what they want. And until we understand the intricacies of those, they're constantly going to run circles around us, and it's going to leave us confused, and it's going to leave us frustrated. So I think, I think that's one of the most powerful components to this book, is that, it lays this out in a way that says, okay, here's the structure and the framework for which these abusers are working, including leadership at churches. Mm-hmm. Because, I don't know if, I'm sure you've run into this a lot, because you're an advocate, and we all experience it. But people who naively think, if I just explain the hurt that's on my heart, the church leaders will have compassion, and they will side with me, and they will help to protect me. That's not the case, is it?
No.
Well, let me say another thing. I served for 15 years on our school board. And when I tell you I saw abuse in the higher ups, I saw it. And there again, I wasn't able to put a word to it, a name to it. But there were so many things that were hidden. Or there were parents that came with legitimate issues with their children, and the tactics, I'll call them tactics, that were used to quiet them just amazed me. And I find it hard to believe that a lot of that wasn't somehow studied and studied by those in power, I'll say, because they were so good at it. And you would leave the meetings thinking, wow, what just happened there? Here's a parent who came in, their child was literally hurt in very real ways, whether it be physical, mental, emotional, whatever it was. And the parent left feeling defeated, depleted, alone, and like a fool. How did that happen? And I witnessed it week after week after week on that level. And I know that still goes on yet today. In any institution like a school, a college, hospitals, I am sure of it. But after 15 years, it's like you just shake your head and say, wow. And yet the public perception was they are the most wonderful people, the most wonderful leadership around. That wasn't so. Yeah. The behind the curtains wasn't the same as what center stage showed.
Wade, why don't you, on the subject, why don't you talk to us a little bit about, or at least what you're able to share with us about your experience with your church leaders, and what that was like, because I think part of the reason why people are naive, I don't say that condescendingly, I say that because I think people genuinely think that the humane thing to do is to see somebody who's bleeding out, spiritually and emotionally, and you step in and help. And I think so many people are surprised when they come to church leadership and they find that the exact opposite takes place, where oftentimes the tables get flipped, so to speak, on the victim, and they're told, why would you bring this up now? Why would you ruin a perfectly good man's reputation? So, I think part of the problem is that people are not privy to what happens in these leadership meetings. I'm a church leader, so I know the down and the dirty. And those meetings are awful, or can be awful. So maybe bring people into that room with you and share what that was like when your church leadership started resisting you and kind of flipping the tables on you and really spiritually abusing you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think my experience is similar to what others have experienced when they go to those who are in a position of trust and are in a position to be able to do something. You walk into that room and you hope and expect that you're going to be met with light, with men and women of integrity who are going to be as equally upset and as equally concerned and as equally willing to do whatever it takes to protect people who have been abused or are at risk. And tragically, what I discovered was that the opposite was true. That instead of being met with light, I was met with darkness, more darkness, and that is a very difficult place to be. And for me, it just rocked me, because you put in time, you put in effort, you collect evidence, not like police evidence, but you hear story, you collect things that need to be revealed, and you put in this work because you want to make sure that you're right and what you're saying is true and you're taking appropriate steps. And all of a sudden, the hope that you had that this is finally going to result in some measure of justice, that hope is dashed, and you discover, no, things are actually about to get worse. And so that's very difficult. And then because you are the one bringing the story or calling for the people in leadership to do the right thing, then you become a threat to them as well. And so for me, that was hard as well, feeling as if I was a target. And then once you become a target, then there's an attempt to discredit you, to gaslight even you, and you wonder, maybe something is wrong with me. Maybe I am making too much of a big deal of this. And so you start doubting your own judgment. And then, when you become a target as well, then there's really nothing that an abusive person might not do in order to stop you. And so they might threaten lawsuit. They might threaten some kind of even physical harm. Facing that kind of intimidation, like something that I will never forget one meeting I had where it was made very clear to me that if I continued to pursue this, that something bad would happen to me. This is not a road that you want to walk down. And
wow,
it's meant to scare. It's meant to threaten. So, there's no end to the deception too. And then even if you fight through that, then, in my case, I was met with, look at what this is doing to the senior pastor, and
the implication definitely is translation. Look what you're doing to the senior pastor.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Right. Yes. Right. Yeah. And I'll just clarify too, because sometimes people wonder about this, in each of the cases that I encountered, a report was made to the police whenever a report needed to be made. But I had to do that against the wishes of others, and it should never be like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's
I find this too, and Jimmy, I'll just say just a second. I know we're kind of in a time crunch, but within the church, when this happens, I think it's devastating to so many people. The harm that is done when something like you experienced happens, a person's faith can be crumbled, can be crushed. We look to our leaders to be those people of honor and integrity and trust and help and faith and all of those things. And when they are not, I was so naive in my younger years. I am so glad, truly, that I didn't know this existed when I was younger, because I'm so afraid of where I would be with my faith right now, because we do place so much trust in people in positions of leadership. And for those leaders within the church who diminish what's happened, who blatantly call it a lie, who turn people away, who snuff out the truth, they're doing a lot more harm than they could ever realize.
Right.
Yeah, I think the reason it's so hurtful and painful, and it's abuse on top of abuse, because there's whatever the abuse was in the first place, the sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, whatever it was, that's bad enough. But then when you approach church leaders and they double down on their abuse of you, it's no wonder that survivors of abuse get so defeated, and they can't do church. They can't physically step foot over the threshold of a church because there's just too much weight and too much trauma. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the reason I've used this analogy before, but I think part of the reason is it's akin to somebody who's literally bleeding out physically, who shows up to the ER, and instead of being rushed back and getting the immediate care that they need to survive, it would be the same as the ER doctor getting the team of nurses to gang up on the patient and to say, "What are you doing here? Why would you come in now? You know, why are you bringing this to us?" And I think we need to really hammer this home to church leaders. The reason they're coming to you is because it's your job. Not just as a church leader, but as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, as somebody who bears the image and the name of Christ. It's our job. It's all of our jobs and our responsibility to fend off the wolves and the people who intentionally are injurious, and to render care to those who are bleeding out spiritually, emotionally, physically, whatever that is. It's our job to do that. And I think we really need to hammer that home. And I think, again, your book, I think really gives people the tools to go into those meetings with church leaders. And first of all, to know what to expect, but second of all, to know how to respond if those conversations start going in that direction, where leaders are covering up, where they're being abusive in their language. I think it really gives the tools to be able to process through that and to think through that. And that's what people need. This book it's very timely. It's very timely.
Well, plus what Wade said, when you're going through this cycle of not being believed or being told basically to be quiet, let things alone, you do begin to doubt yourself. And am I making too much of this? Did I really hear things right? Did I understand that person correctly? Am I the one who's going a little, I actually thought I was going crazy, by the way, for a while in my own life. Your book is affirming. Your book is sure. Your book is truthful. Your book puts words to what we're feeling. And I so appreciate that so very much. Truly. Did a really good job with that.
Yep, for sure.
Yes, truly.
I want you to talk about abuse for a while, because one of, I don't want to say criticism, that's not the right word. One of the recommendations, I guess, that Mom and I get a lot is, you have this podcast, the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. Why don't you talk about physical violence, domestic violence? Why don't you talk about, and people will talk about all these different forms of abuse, and they want us to address that because they see all these parallels between sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, and these other forms of abuse. We don't do that a whole lot because we just, my area of specialty is child sexual abuse. That's just where I focus my research mostly. But there is a lot of blending. There is a lot of overlap. So why don't you talk to us about abuse? What is abuse? And how do we think in terms of these overlaps?
Yeah. Abuse, I think it is the very simplest definition is to use somebody wrongly within the context of an interpersonal relationship. And so that can take a variety of forms. It can be physical, it can be emotional, can be sexual. Then there's financial abuse, and there's psychological, there's so many different forms in which somebody can be used wrongly. And then there's all these different contexts, so there's ritual abuse. There's sibling abuse. There's intimate partner violence. So there's all these different contexts also that help us understand what type of abuse we're talking about. I think the overlap is often found in the techniques of deception, in the ways in which people are tricked. I think all abuse sets some kind of trap, and the abuser is a thief who's setting a trap for somebody else to walk into. And once that person's in that trap, then the abuser takes what isn't his or hers to take. And so I think there's some overlap at a conceptual level of just seeing the abuser as a deceitful person who is, in a sense, lying in wait at the intersection of circumstances and opportunity, and sets a trap, and then does harm to that person who's now under the control of that abuser. So I think so much of the overlap is found in the deception that's used in order to trick somebody into walking into that trap.
As you were talking here, Wade, there was something that came to mind that for me is just so blatant in the scriptures. As you being, you spent years being a pastor, theology really matters. And, in Galatians 6:1, Paul says to gently restore those who are caught in a sin. The word that Paul uses there, in the original language, it's a sense of being slowly drawn into something. And then you get to this point of no return where it's too late. Paul's not using that language for abusers. He's using that language for people who've been oppressed, who've been abused in different ways. When Paul or Jesus or Peter or Jude or, anybody in the Bible talks about deception and masquerading, pretending to be somebody who you're not, false prophets is a word that's used a lot. Never is there this idea of gentle restoration. Paul says things like have nothing to do with them in 2 Timothy chapter 3. Avoid such people. Paul says evil people and imposters go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. And so you have this very clear distinction in my mind in the scriptures where those who are methodically abusing people and oppressing people, and they know exactly what they're doing, and they're setting the traps, they get a very different response than the people who are entrapped. And I think within leadership, church leadership, we kind of see two main responses. One is the equalizing of sin. Well, we all have skeletons in our closet. We're all sinners. Can't you offer grace just like you received grace? They'll say that about the abuser, or they'll turn the tables and they'll make the victim out to be the aggressor and say things like, you're just shining light. You're just being a gossip. You're shining light in somebody's skeletal closet when you have your own skeletons. So knock it off. Do you find that to be true, that we have this blurring of sins and how to handle those?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most common responses within Christianity that we need to confront. So often somebody is exposed and then the community responds by saying, well, he or she is really no different than any one of us. They're just human. We all make mistakes. And I think you're right to draw that distinction that's found throughout the Bible between those who are human and will make mistakes and will sin, and those who are intentionally and very deceptively setting traps for other people to walk into. And
Yeah.
not everybody is out to trap you, but there are some people who are out to trap other people. And that person is inherently unsafe and inherently deceptive. And we need to understand that we're talking about two different things.
Yeah. Absolutely. And again, I'll keep going back to your book because that's what we're here to talk about. But I think that's one of the really important things about your book is that, it shows how people set those traps, and it's saying like this is not just people messing up or people thinking about something and being tempted and being drawn into that. That's not what this is. This is people who, are you still there? Oh,
yes. Yep.
We lost your video for a second.
Okay.
But this is a class of people who they know what they want. They know what the goal is, and they know how to get there. They know how to use you in the process of getting there. And when push comes to shove, and they got what they want, you're disposable. The victim is disposable. And that's the antithesis of Christ-like living, of being a light, of being somebody who has care and concern for your neighbor and love for your neighbor, and even love for God. I think it's so important to show people there's this radical distinction in the scriptures about this. Like, it's not just us saying that abusers are different. God himself talks about it a lot. And that's really important. So, okay, I want to ask if somebody feels like something's not right, they have that intuition kicked up, they feel like they're being manipulated. What first step would you recommend for them? What direction should they go?
Well, I think it's always important for somebody in that situation to choose for themselves, what would be best for them. Because one of the things that often happens when you're in that abusive environment is agency and choice is taken from you. And so I think it's good to give people options. I think one thing that helped me and could help somebody else is to take an inventory of what you know to be true. And so, for example, the senior pastor who I kept having to meet with, and those meetings never went well, at different points would say to me, where is this root of bitterness coming from? Why are you so angry? And I'd walk away from that feeling very confused because I wasn't yelling. That wasn't something I identified in myself. And so there was one night when I decided to just write out all the events and situations and things that had happened that had angered me. And I just kept writing. I was angry when, I was angry when, I was angry when. And hours into the night, I wrote, and I didn't realize how much evil there was, and that I had every right to be angry, and that everybody should be angry. And for me, that was sort of the first time that I told this story back to myself and took an inventory of what I knew to be true. And that was eye-opening for me. It was also affirming. And then I think also it could be helpful to talk to somebody else. And that can be hard, and it can be difficult to find somebody who is both competent and caring. But if you can find that person who will listen to your story in an unrushed way, I think that's really important too, because hopefully that person can also help you unravel all of those threads that have been tangled up and help you make sense of your experience, and then also help you to attach some language to what you've gone through, and then help you identify some steps that maybe you can take. And so that was also what was really helpful to me, So it was sometime after I did that self-inventory that I met with a professional psychologist and told my entire story. And that was a freeing day for me when I did that.
That's very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess along that line, if you were speaking to victims of abuse who are reading your book, what do you hope that they will be encouraged to do, or that they will gain from reading this book?
I hope that it will give them some hope. One of the things that I've written about is the ways in which you become de-hoped when you suffer in silence for a significant period of time, and you wonder, does anybody understand what I'm going through? And I hope that as somebody reads this book and they've been victimized, they are being victimized, that this might be a moment in which they're affirmed and perhaps provided some hope that, okay, there is a way to make sense of this, and there are people out there that I can reach out. There are lots of professionals out there who are doing great work, and I would just encourage the victim survivor who reads this to do some research, to reach out to trusted organizations, and to see if there might be help out there.
Awesome. And I'll ask this other question so that people don't get the impression that we're against churches and against church leadership. My very first passion is the church. I want to see the church do well. I don't want to see people abandon the church. I want to see the church get well. So speaking to church leaders who may be picking up your book, what do you hope that they would gain from reading this book?
I hope that they can see the insidious nature of deception. And I hope that their eyes will be open just to how damaging it can be. Because I think one of the things that happens is leadership perhaps doesn't take the time to grasp the extent of the harm and the scope and the severity of the trauma. And so they don't operate then out of a place of compassion and empathy and understanding. And so I hope that this will open their eyes perhaps to that. And then I also hope it will encourage them to speak truth whenever they encounter the deception of the abuser, because I do think that there are a lot of good people in our churches who want to do the right thing, but they're often encountering a highly deceptive person in a position of power, and they perhaps bring something that they believe is true and they want to do the right thing, but then they're met with a wall of deception, and they don't know what to do with that. And so I hope that this book will empower those who sincerely want to do the right thing, but perhaps they don't know what to say, or they don't know even how to identify various tactics of deception that are being used against them.
Very good. Well, Dr. Wade Mullen, Something's Not Right. How do people order your book?
They can order it on, I know, the Tyndale website. It's there. I know it's on Amazon. They can go to my website, wadetmullen.com, and then I have a page just dedicated to the book, and then I have a number of links on there where they can buy it at various stores.
Very good. Well, Wade, it's been an honor. Truly a good book.
Yes.
Lots of years of hard work coming to fruition, and for you to take the time and write it down and articulate this is very important. So I thank you for that. Thank you for being a guest on the podcast, and I'm excited to see where this book takes us.
Thank you, Jimmy, and thank you, Clara, for the opportunity to speak with you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, we thank you for tuning into this episode, and we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron. And check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.